I am happy to have Jonathan Bullock here today, also known as JB, sort of known universally as JB. Um, I first met JB at Google, where he was strategy director and chief of staff. Both of these jobs were jobs I didn't understand at the time, but he was always involved in all of the interesting challenges of the global business organization, so he popped up pretty much everywhere. Which is great. He went on to join SoftBank International as COO or Chief Operating Officer of the fund, and now as a scale-up advisor, focusing on helping chief operating officers and chiefs of staff set up operating models and succeed and scale in their business. He's got a website, imjb.com. You can go there and check it out. I think it's a little, it's not the. He's in the process of doing more social things, so he'll appear in more places as time goes on. But on imjb.com, there's a lot of great writing that he's put together over the years. Have a read of that. But he's here now in person, so I'll welcome him on the screen now. JB, welcome. How are you doing?
Okay, good to see you today, and
Excellent.
everybody else out there.
Yes, excellent. So just to start off with, maybe we can just go back over a bit of your history and what you were doing at Google for a start, and what chief of strategy and chief of staff were at Google, and that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So, well, this was a long time ago. So people got to remember this was 15 plus years ago, in the post-IPO days of Google when it was pre-forming. So this was pre-Android, pre-Chrome on the first days, back to that stage of the internet.
Yeah.
And Google was forming then. It was public, had a few thousand people operating around the world, and had an initial revenue model, but very initial. No YouTube purchase. So
Yeah,
this
I
was
remember that.
very early days, right? And so the role was to help the business organization, and initially in Europe, but then actually pretty quickly globally, scale itself and work out what it's doing and organize itself across functions, geographies, channels, and all that good stuff. Just for orientate folks who don't know Google, which is pretty much the same today in the alphabet days, but you can think of Google as 50% engineering and product, or mostly engineering, and then 50% the business organization, which is all the fun and joy of sales, marketing, service, customer service, hardware sales, enterprise sales, all of that wonderful world with sort of thin layers of HR and finance and legal that goes on top of it. And so really it was to organize that 50% and help that 50% organize itself, long, medium, and short term, and then importantly interface with the emerging engineering and product organization, which went through many, many iterations. Sundar at this stage was, still a sort of a product VP in that organization, and hence, in terms of day to day, all the joys of organizing leadership offsites and taking the whole business organization, the interesting places, and doing those all handsy type piece of work, through to longer term strategies, M&A, inorganic and organic strategies, and then of course the prevalent OKRs and actually working out what is an OKR in those days. So that was a joyous nearly decade there spent all this time. So
yeah, I think I joined Google about the same time. It was 2006 that I joined, and my part was in sort of like the part of engineering that worked for sales. So like we were or worked for the partnerships organization, but that was part of the sales organization generally. Who was the leader that you were working for? Which was that under Nikesh, or was that in Europe?
Omid and Nikesh.
Omid and Nikesh,
Omid and Nikesh, and then broader, then you've got across the whole Dennis Woodside, Margot Georgiadis, Schindler, of course, Lorraine Thuhill. Sheryl Sandberg had just left at that stage, so that was in the flip of the organization. So yes, effectively the non-product C-suite.
For sure.
Who's the FD? Those were the and a little bit with the sort of Erics of the world, because when we had to write his earnings and interface there. So, but that was a little bit. It was more the business organization.
Yeah, for sure. Did you find that? Did you have to do a lot of work with the product and engineering organizations as well? Like, was that interface? Was that something that you were heavily involved in?
Yes, initially, very honestly, it was about getting really helping the business organization work itself out,
Yeah.
and so it could scale efficiently. Google had scaled so fast, everybody had just tried to build themselves fast and was very successful around the world. But then you needed to go, well, okay, how do we don't need 4 CRM systems, we need one CRM system. So it was to build that first and foremost. And then um, early 2010, 2011, 2012, focus increasingly worked on, okay, how do we interface into the product organizations in a better
Yeah.
way? And there were substantive and very successful organizations built to scale, not around the sort of solutions, which is the classic sort of matrix organization, product via a solutions group. Um, and it was always interesting, actually, how does the technical end of that sit? So the types of role you did, and how does that sit
Yeah, for
into
sure.
organization? But complex, hard, difficult problems, difficult scaling problems.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. I remember once in the scaling, maybe it wasn't the scaling question, but certainly I remember the sales organization reorganized from being product driven to sort of regional driven, or sort of product driven to industry driven. I think it was. It sort of went from having, and certainly our partnerships team also had a reorganization very much like this, where they had, specifically AdSense partners, and then they went to more of an industry focus or more of a regional focus and so on. They're sort of changing that structure, which has a whole lot of stuff. Is that stuff that you were involved in as well?
Yeah, very much
Okay.
so. The whole org
Yeah.
design, business, and channels which are still there are still how you divide large, medium, and small.
Yeah.
And Google went through a number of iterations of that challenge, and then super large, the global players, how to interface with a
Yeah.
Apple or Coca-Cola or Amazon is a different game again. So always the geographic versus business solution industry sector versus your product solution interface, and how do you sort of solve that Rubik's cube
Yeah.
in large organizations is a challenge, and keep them agile
Yeah,
is
for
a
sure.
challenge.
That makes sense. And then you went after that to SoftBank, and I presume was that part of like the fact, because Nikesh obviously went to SoftBank after being head of business at Google. Were you recruited by him or by that sort of group or that connection?
Yeah, there was a group, a group that sort of went across from SoftBank and other places as well, and really, SoftBank, sorry, from Google and other places as well. SoftBank was a really emerging and interesting, and still is, and a very interesting conglomerate, tech conglomerate, investing conglomerate. Um, and so around that time, it was a question around, well, what did I want to do? I
Yeah.
wanted to sort of still be hands-on. Obviously, there's always a lure into the very interesting investment management
Yeah.
areas and operations, and I can talk more about that, all the way from VC to growth to private equity. Um, and so really it was to come and actually try and help SoftBank work out what is this international strategy, how does it
Right.
go,
Right.
and this was, prior to really the Vision Fund by a couple of years, when not many folks outside of a core group had heard of SoftBank.
Hmm.
It was known, it had huge holdings in Alibaba. In Japan, it was huge holding in Yahoo Japan,
Yeah.
and a sort of Vodafone, if you like, in its own right in Japan. But internationally, the brand wasn't there until really the Vision Fund sort of
Yeah, for sure.
authorized that.
It took off around that stage when it suddenly became 100
That's right.
billion, or some crazy amount of money. But yeah, okay, interesting. And so your role there was that you were were you involved in the investments or just the operations of the fund or both?
Uh, I'm not an investor. I sit on boards and those things, but I'm not an investor, and that's not my plan to ever be an investor. I
Yeah.
understand it, but really it was to help with SoftBank and many others. Started a bit of this at Google and since in other places. It's really to help investment firms scale themselves,
Yeah.
which is really if you understand investment firms, sort of front, middle, and back office. It's to help with the middle and back office, and also the interface and setup of the front office.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and so, really, the areas I don't get involved with and didn't in the Vision Fund is LP management, i.e., who
Yeah.
the investors in the fund are. That's a
Yeah.
very unique, specialized thing. And then the actual sort of front office decisions of, okay,
Yep.
what is our thematic investing philosophy? Who should
Yeah.
we invest in? What's the diligence? Those things. I do get involved in sort of running ICs, but that's more in a facilitative type of way. So it's about making the machine work so that the investors can do what they do, which is
Yeah,
source and select, and then manage, depending on what their sort of management style and ethos
yeah.
is, their investments.
So when you say running ICs, what does that mean? I don't know what the IC means in
Well,
this context.
IC is an investment committee.
Investment committee,
Apologies, investment committee. So all VCs, private equity, growth equity firms have an investment committee. Some of these are more formal and less formal. Once you become bigger and much more regulated, they become quite formal in terms of
right?
how they are to run and what is expected of them and the levels of diligence. And these can be quite interesting and complicated
Yeah,
entities, where you've typically got between 3 to 6 to 8 or possibly more partners trying to make a collective decision.
yeah,
And however they decide to make a collective decision, to invest and consequently follow on invest or divest these things. So they are quite complicated sort of leadership
yeah,
discussion and decision forums, because they're never or rarely are they a plain vote, or one kingmaker makes the decision.
yeah,
It
for
does
sure.
happen.
Yeah, for sure. And so the work that you were doing at SoftBank, you obviously had a lot of exposure to the investments that SoftBank was making and how they're operating and all that sort of stuff. And now you're working as a Scaleup advisor. So you advise COOs and chief of staffs and so on, and CEOs, I believe, at times, but you're focused on the CEO. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I've done my 2.5 decades of being an exec, being in that front line and running those things with teams and managing people, and which is fascinating and hands-on and a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
So now I'm sort of, I suppose, in a luxurious position that really I spend my time trying to just do the value-added piece. And my sort of clients I work with, I work very quietly with investment firms to really, when they're trying to do their sort of second or third act,
Yeah.
they may have they typically had a very successful first or second fund,
Yeah.
or even third fund. They might have 30, 40 people. They might be good in one geography or one region, London-based Europe. And they might go, well, okay, I now need to grow internationally or work out a more complicated organization. And growing from a 30-person investment firm, 100 million, 200 million, even a billion, to try and connect that is
Yeah.
hard, and run into some quite interesting problems. So I help that group very quietly.
Yeah.
Not the startup of the fund as much, but really the scaling.
The scaling.
And then the other group that sort of pings me lots on LinkedIn and wants increasingly help and support is really the COO or very senior chief of staff, who probably is actually a COO type, who is often overwhelmed, highly competent, lots of things to do, has interesting less execution challenges because quite a lot of the tools are well understood. But it's a question of, okay, how do I pass these things through? How do I manage across leadership team when you have some degree of influence, but not command and control influence?
Yeah.
And then how do I manage and work with a founder or board who come in all sorts of interesting flavors? But typically, if there's a pretty organized and structured and diligent COO chief of staff, there's a yin to a yang, and so there's often challenges with some very good founders, but have more aspirational, visional, always throwing thoughts and ideas into the mix, and that takes some management.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting. And so given your experience at SoftBank, I mean, one of the things that I'm sure people ask you is, how do I make my company investable? Like, how do I be the kind of organization that's easy to invest in or is attractive and so on? What advice do you have for leaders, and especially like partly the CEO, but also other leaders in the organization, because they play a massive part in this, right?
Yeah, a great question. Question I get asked all the time. First off, there is no silver bullet. Secondly, build a good business. Don't build a shell or a presentation. Build a good business first and foremost, and we can discuss what good business means. But build a good business, and then there is a bit of a process and a game, if I'm being very honest, to the investing side.
Right.
And I say this from a perspective of somebody who's sat in Google perspective. So try to look at this from a strategic investing.
Mm-hmm.
I've sat on the perspective of a large sort of PE growth, sort of, I suppose, super VC, not classic VC, but we did have VC pockets and how they invest.
Yep.
And more recently, I've sat on the other side of the fence and tried to help folks get investment. The first thing I would say is that it's a very different, there are some common tenets, but it's a very different game pre-product market fit, from post-product market fit to pre-IPO, and then the post-IPO. So if you break it into those three lumps, the pre-product market fit, I'm not going to go into detail there. That isn't honestly my expertise. The headline message when you speak to VCs and these things is work on your product. You can work on anything else, but like product is king. Get product and good customers and good usage, get to that product market fit, which isn't a binary event, but product. And if you read all of Andreessen's and everybody else, pre-product market fit, and they define it, that's the focus.
Yeah.
From product market fit, scaling. So this is really Series A, B, C, D. It is a game, and there is some techniques there.
Oh, this is really interesting, because for my business as well, I tend to focus on businesses that are beyond series. They usually have had their Series A, sometimes often Series B, D, or B, C, or D. And in terms of like the size, because of what I'm doing is mostly OKR, helping with executive teams and setting OKRs and so on, that becomes really valuable when you get to 50, 80, 200 people thereabouts, and you start to be not able to manage this with just talking to everybody, because there's too many people, and so your way of managing doesn't work anymore. So we help them come up with different ways of managing. So that's actually really interesting from my perspective, and that's because I have found I did a lot of work previously with before product market fit companies in the really, really early stage, and I found that I was able to help them a lot, but the likelihood of success was relatively low. So the net value I was adding was relatively low. It was really hard to have an impact. Whereas at these companies, I'm able to have an impact, and I find that interesting. But you're saying that basically at that stage, there's more of a game that needs to be played to ensure that you're investable, and not just it's a good business, but you're an investable business. Is that right?
Yes, totally. So I would agree with you. A well-run pre-product market fit company is hard to get investment for. It's the bottom line. Again, I'm not the expert. Go and speak to good angels, good seed investors there in your product domain if that's your space. I think post Series A, in the areas that you work in, and I work in various elements, I suppose, it becomes complex, and the game becomes one of managing complexity. You've typically got 100, 200 people. You have 10 million, 15 million. You have to hit a growth curve because you've taken back money. You've typically faced the Anzoff matrix problem, where you've got to go, okay, I've got a core product. Do I keep investing in the core product? Do I enhance and develop and expand the core product? And also, do I go international, especially if you're non-US based? And that adds complexity. You typically have a second generation of leaders that come in that adds extra complexity, that want to do the things in their way, often in a way which is too advanced. And so the problem becomes quite complex and overwhelming. And that's why you do need the things that you do, like on simple, clever, focused OKRs to help folks in that area. As for the investment side, because that's again back to sort of, I would say, building a good business that is operationally well run and strategically well run. In terms of investing, really investing, and I've recently made public all the slides that I've used to help sort of Series B, C, D founders over the years, because I found that I was helping about 5 to 10 of them. And so I just said, I'm just going to make all my material public, which has been quite good. But really, the investing game, when you come to fundraise, comes to sort of 3 things. You need a pitch, and a pitch deck, and everything that goes around that. And there's an absolute formulaic way of doing that. It has got to be X slides long. You can tell what the story arc is of those slides. Literally you can do that pretty, I'm going to say color by numbers. The second area that you need to get right is the process. For when you're trying to raise between 10 and 100 or 200 million, there is a formulaic process as well around how long these things take to do.
Right, yeah. I imagine that
It is
most CEOs, most executives don't really know that process that well though, because it's the first
first,
time that most of them are doing it, right?
yeah, first time founders sort of, and raising early stage is not quite the same as raising mid stage.
Yeah,
So first time founders, it is the first time through this. There are some great VCs out there that guide on
yeah,
these areas. Um, but often you've got to remember at this point, they're trying to run a business, scale a business, solve all those things because the growth has got to continue.
yeah,
So that's often when they bring in actually, they have a COO or a CFO or a chief of staff that runs around and does quite a lot of the legwork there.
yeah,
So the second area is the doing the legwork, running the process, the timelines, the managing the who, working out which VCs you want to go after. There are
yeah,
like 20,000 VCs, but you can save a lot of time by working out the 150 that are actually relevant to you.
yeah, for
Classic.
sure.
And then the last thing is the investment case. When you're asking people for 20, 30 X million, you have to have lovely big spreadsheets which show all sorts of scenarios. Because
Right.
not often the VC partner, but their associates will crawl all over those and ask you some quite hard, what happens for your second cohort's churn in this area, in this market. And so you need to get those ducks in a row. So those are the
Yeah.
three things: pitch deck, process, and the investment case.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of the COO's perspective, by the way, we have about 10 or 15 people watching. If you guys are watching and you have a question for JB or for myself, but particularly JB, because this is about him, drop it in the comments in LinkedIn, and I should see it. I have a slight problem with one connection, which maybe I don't get the comment, but hopefully I will. If we don't, we'll get back to you later on LinkedIn anyway. But feel free to drop it in LinkedIn, and I'll raise it if I can see it. Which I should be able to. And feel free to say hi if you want. Yes, I was just going to ask you about that sort of process part. That's obviously something that the COO and your chief of staff, the people you work with mostly now, are presumably quite involved with. This is not something that you just do as a CFO and a CEO individually. You kind of wanted to get. I'm making the assumption here, I guess, but is there
It,
not something that you have to do that?
it depends. The CEO always has to be the pitch, the front, the lead, the conversation. But as I said, there's quite a lot of legwork here, which shouldn't be done by the CEO. Now that
Yeah,
doesn't have to be done by COO or a chief of staff, but typically they should have somebody that helps them and gives them leverage at that point. And here again, this is a company. These are companies that have got 100 people,
yeah,
and they're trying to raise you know 10 million plus, and so having a extra pair of hands and leverage in this model works. Some COOs take the lead with the CEO coming and doing the product visionary piece,
yeah,
if they have a COO in that instance. Some CFOs lead it. It really depends, but the
yeah.
CEO always has to be the pitch.
Lead,
The
yeah.
lead investor wants to see the CEO and the founder, but there's a lot of legwork which doesn't actually have to be hands on with the CFO.
Yeah, for sure. And so then the CEO is spending more time with running the business. Then, I mean, what's your advice for a COO in that situation? Like, we're either about to raise, we're just raised, or whatever it is. What's going on, and what's your advice for them in this scale
Yeah,
up?
it always depends on those things, but most CEOs are product centric and visionary. Most CEOs will give the guidance and actually be hands on with the lead lighthouse customers. Will effectively run, and it'd be interesting to see what your experience is. Most CEOs will effectively run the product organization and be quite hands on with technical
Yeah,
decisions. And if they have a COO in the mix, the COO at a scale up is classically doing, and the interesting question is, do they run sales? If they run sales and are more
oh,
a full spectrum COO, like a Sheryl Sandberg, for instance,
okay,
um, then it becomes, they can often do the execution of the fundraise,
yeah,
and they will run the OKRs and coordinate the various groups and help coordinate, especially if they run marketing, the pitch deck. If they have the finance director that reports to them, that's clearly the investment model. And quite often, it's an interesting question around, do you have a COO or a chief of staff? But in the instance of your question, if there's a strong COO in the mix, they'll often run that. But it doesn't have to be that way.
yeah,
It can be the other way, and I've also seen it work very successfully where the CEO says, "No, I want to own this." They have a founder's associate, if you like,
Yep.
help and support them and produce the deck. And they spend the time running around the world trying to raise the money, dialing in product, whilst the COO focuses on, traction, revenue, customers, and running the business day to day.
Yeah.
So there's no golden answer here. You've got to look at the individuals
Mm.
involved, what their
Yeah.
strengths, skill sets, and interests are.
It's funny. So one of the patterns that I've seen in my clients has been not all of them, but quite a few of them have had the founder has moved on, and there's now a new CEO who's non-founder, and they're not in those cases. Just thinking through them, in most cases they're not they're not necessarily the technical or product person. They're more of a business person or an investor type person, and so that's been really interesting. So and then the head of operations or the person who's running the operating. In fact, in one case, the CEO basically is also the COO, like they run the operations as well. In another case, they have a mixture of things going on there. And there's a few other cases as well, but it's just interesting though that can be really different. But I mean, in terms of like when you're coming in, you're sort of helping that COO to scale, right? That's what you're trying to do. Is there sort of some place you always start with the new COO, like when you have someone who's come in and say, "Hey JB, I need some help."
Well, yeah, you start at the beginning and listen and see if there are any burning platforms. Is the simple answer. What's on fire that we need to fix today. But
Yeah.
going back to your comment, and we can then revert to that. Yeah, pre-IPO, where there's a founder that's moved on, and classically boards will actually bring in, as you say, a more classic CEO, business-centric CEO, somebody with an MBA. Then they do take the lead, and you don't, in that instance, always have, and honestly even need COO.
Okay.
The
Yep.
COO role should be designed on the basis of who the CEO is.
Right.
And you look at most big companies, although COO roles are on the rise, I think most big companies there's only 50%, less than 50%, which is up from the 10, 15% at I think the turn of the century, have a COO, but it is not
Yeah.
a default model. Google doesn't have a COO, and
Yeah. True. I never really
so
thought about
I'm not
that
sure about
actually.
Amazon recently, but so it's not a you need a COO is the answer to everything.
Yeah.
Uh, Very much not. As for sort of when anybody asks you, "Hey, can you come and help me?" Listen, listen to their challenges, listen to what they're coming from, and their challenges come in all shapes and sizes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Reality. Sometimes they just need somebody to talk to and bounce ideas off and pass and say, okay, is this a sort of structured way and have you seen things done differently?
Yeah.
Other times a bit more hands-on. But generally speaking, the challenges of a COO and a CEO break into strategy.
Yep.
If you don't have a good strategy, it doesn't matter what your structure and operations are, you're toast. So strategy, operations.
Yep.
So are you running yourself efficiently? Is it organized? Are we prioritizing? Have we got our translation from strategy into OKRs? OKRs are not strategy. Are we executing well? Thirdly, it's people.
Yep.
And it often is a people challenges that folks have. How do I layer? I don't have the capability to grow. Only a third of my team is really rock stars. The other third will grow. The other third I have to sort of layer in some way.
Layer as
How
in
to
like
do that?
higher above them and like
That's correct.
keeping that basically that involves reducing their scope and getting someone else to lead that group as the organization scales, as opposed to scaling their scope with the organization.
Yeah, not every individual can grow. A lot of these businesses are growing at 30%, 50% CAGR. It's very hard to grow your skills. And
Yeah.
you might have been awesome and have experience running a sales team, say, that has 10 million sales, but that's a different game to running an international sales team that's got 100 million sales.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the third area is people, and get the leader themselves has to become more sophisticated, especially for founders, and evolve in their
Yeah.
management style, their leadership style, how they lead large organizations. So leadership, classically COOs are quite familiar with sort of raising organizations, so it's more about how do they help others and make the team work.
Yeah.
Um, Fourthly, it is fundraising and sales cash. The cash is the lifeblood, as we all know. you've either got to fundraise or you've got to be bringing in sales that sort of prove the fundraise and enable you to
Yeah.
step on. So cash and the business structuring and the economics of a business is often an area, but typically that's where you, and all these areas, I'll work with somebody, but sometimes the answer is yes, you need a proper FD here. Let's
Yeah.
bring in an expert forward. It's time for you to hire a proper people officer
Yeah.
um, as you scale. So it's not that I have all the answers. Sometimes it's building out the team. And the fifth area is leadership.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Leader grows and styles, which quite often, as you said, is around the founders and how does founders evolve in this process.
Yeah.
COOs are quite, if they're not a founder COO, are quite often brought in as part of that journey that boards take businesses on.
Yeah,
So
for
those are the
sure.
areas. Um,
Yeah, I mean, certainly in my experience, like because as you know, going with OKRs, usually it's the CEO who brings me in, and sometimes it's other parts of the exec team. We talk about OKRs and so on. OKRs are actually not that complicated, and so we spend some time on them. But then where we actually spend most of our time is what is the strategy and how do you translate that strategy into objectives? And the funny thing that I found is that a lot of companies think they have a strategy until they try and translate it into objectives. Then they realize they don't have a strategy, or their strategy is not clear enough, or it's not focused enough, or something like that. And so they can't make decisions to create objectives. And then the other thing that happens is and on the execution side of that, like we now have objectives to execute. So now how are we focusing our execution on this? And we find out that actually there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. There's a whole lot of things that are happening that are not necessarily helping. And we have no mechanism to actually make sure we execute the things we want to execute. This is like the operations part, but the execution part really. And then also, of course, it also relates to people as well. So all these sorts of things come, sort of like from that leverage point there. I'm just interested in your take on that.
Yeah, that echoes my experience totally, especially with sort of fast growing, successful scaling businesses that haven't sort of reached a common norm yet,
Yeah.
across geographies and channels. The folks will say, okay, OKRs is a good topic, and I spent too much of my life in OKRs in Google time and since.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
often OKRs are sort of a shell for other challenges. Um, as
Yeah.
businesses grow, types of businesses I think that we'll come across, what worked was the initial product was good and great, but you do get into these, okay, am I focusing, how am I splitting my resources on the core product, evolving the product
Oh,
and growing
yeah.
internationally? And that the strategy that you need around that and how you prioritize and how you do these things, and just because it worked in market one and product one, is it going to work in market two with product one, and is it going to work with sort of sales approach one with product two?
Yeah.
That's complicated strategy questions which I find people haven't quite, with all the rush and all the business, thought through enough.
Yeah.
um, and then when, hallelujah, you go and have your offsite and solve and the team gets focused and it gets a little bit of traction, you find that you run into operational challenges,
Right.
which is what we're both seeing, right?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I have one customer that has an interesting situation that's really relevant to that. They have like a prior core product in the core market and so on, which is going well and growing in the right kind of way, but they need to change how they're doing this. And they have some real challenges actually. It's going well, but they have massive challenges that are sort of holding them back. At the same time, they're trying to expand into other markets and other products and other countries and so on like that. How do you help people figure out where to put their energy? Like, because in some sense, looking at this, you can say, just stop with the other stuff until you sort out your main course. But at the same time, if you do that, then are you going to get the growth that you need to deliver the investment promise?
Complex question. I think the answer is, well, first of all, there's a different answer here for US based companies, which are
Right.
really growing into a market of 330 million. So they can get much further in their growth journey without
Right.
facing the complexities of internationalization. For European, UK, and other European based companies, you don't have that headroom of market. So you quite quickly, most Western European are 50, 60, 70 million. And so that's only a fraction of the US. So you face the international challenge a lot faster
Yeah.
in your life stage. And so that's quite significant complexity or a dimension of complexity that hits you earlier in the stage. The headline here, I find, is you have to be brutally focused.
Yeah.
You have to be brutally focused and do that. So then the question comes, well, how do you do that? Having a good board and having a founder and founding team that can recognize that and take some hard choices around what not to do.
Yeah.
The old cliche strategy is more around what not to do.
Yeah.
It is key. A model that really works that I would suggest people Google and look at is the sort of 70-20-10 model,
Okay.
which is really trying to think about the resources, the core resources. This is 70% of our effort. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
precisely 70%, but
Yeah.
here's the 70%, here's the 20%, which is the adjacent, the growth, the experimental, the next wave, and then the 10%, which is the moonshots, innovation, let's try and do something.
Yeah.
Which in reality, in resource deployment, probably looks more like 85, 12-2 for
Yeah.
for a sort of Series BC firm, I would suggest. The Google and the big FANG companies try to sort of make it a 70-20-10, but it's really a much smaller percentage of it.
Right. Right. So you find that most people sort of like, do you think that that's an error? Like they're investing too much in their main business, or is that the right thing to do at that stage? Or I guess it depends on the company, obviously, but I mean, as a
It
general
depends
rule.
on the company, but if if you're trying to raise a Series B or trying to raise a Series C, often that's all about traction and all
Yeah.
about your revenue and customer curve, which is typically all about putting juice behind whatever was the initial product market fit. So you have to sort of eat into the adoption curve and go from the 2%, 5% and
Mm.
into that mass adoption area,
Right.
which often is not a question of the new bell and whistle. It's about doing the core better, slicker, with better marketing, getting people to know it
Yeah.
at that stage, rather than trying to think the new funky thing that is going to differentiate you.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
Back to our earlier conversation, if you're much earlier in your life stage, yes, the new funky bell whistle, the way you do these things is probably more important.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So if you're much earlier in your life cycle, then the new thing's more
Pre
important.
product market fit.
Because basically then you're 100% you don't have anything to execute yet.
And also what makes your product good, special, different, that you
Yeah.
can attract away from your competitors. Because everybody has competitors, even if it's just where people spend their time or money on a different area today,
Yeah.
you're trying to suck that across.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to ask you a question about something, I guess on a different angle, which is uh, have you come across COOs or chief of staffs who failed, and what's the situation that causes failure? What's the biggest mistakes you've seen made, and how do we avoid them?
I can talk about my career is basically often what I'm doing is saying, hey, I've made these things being mistakes. Don't make these mistakes, right?
Yeah,
So it's often around like things not to do, rather than like here is the magic thing to do and it's going to solve all of your challenges and problems. Um, the couple of overriding things is focus on your core business and build a really good business that has got some core simple customer proposition at it that works with an economic model that works.
yeah,
Anybody can build a business that is, selling $100 bills for $90. So that's the first thing. So build a good business. Secondly, keep things simple.
yeah,
A lot of problems are caused again because people don't focus on what a core business and the core value proposition is. A lot of problems and mistakes are caused because there's just too much going on.
yeah.
Teams are overwhelmed. You're trying to grow in too many places. You're trying to make it too complicated. Let's have a got 4-channel strategy and you're 100 person, or here's our 6 products, and I'm like,
I guess
it's
this
worth
comes like
penny.
when you've started out as like 10 people and suddenly you get 50 million or 10 million or whatever it is, and then you grow from 10 people to 20 or 50, 80 people, you suddenly think, well, I can do 4 times as many things now, because I'm now 4 times bigger. But what you're saying here is that you're still at that traction gaining stage, and you're still, and even with 80 people, you still need to develop the focus.
uh, my 2 cents, my general advice is stick on your core and evolve from it, but don't forget your core. And for operators or people running these things, try to keep stuff simple through in the areas you work in, the sort of scaling stage. When you get to sort of pre-IPO or somebody's giving you hundreds of millions, that's a slightly different an interesting challenge. Or if you're a Google or an Amazon or Facebook or a very large corporate,
Yeah.
or that's a different sort of beast. But in this instance, which I think is the question you're asking, it's keep things simple, stick on the core, keep evolving, make the growth healthy and strong. That's the key, I think, to success in these things. I think you're right that, and I have seen folks invest a lot of money into businesses that are established, or maybe even have product market fit, but sort of the fast scaling, doing things super hyper fast, uh, is, in my opinion, only works if you're also hyper focused. And that's a
Yeah.
very difficult thing to do. If somebody gives you 100 million, it's very hard to stay hyper focused because you can do lots of things.
Yeah.
Often, especially nowadays, I think people, if they give you lots of money, they do put strings on it because it's like, look, I'm giving you 100 million, 90 million of that must go into the core marketing or core replicating something, rather than brand new interesting product areas or
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
tier markets.
And it's tough to do that as a founder or as an early stage employee because that's what you have been doing. You have
It's a
been doing
different
the
game.
other stuff. Yeah. 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 Exactly. And I guess
Scaling is
in
just
many ways, that's
fast.
when you bring the COO in, it's because you're actually trying to invest in that replication in the growth as opposed to the new stuff. And so that's what the CEOs are there to do. Is that right?
uh, People bring COOs or introduce structures for all sorts of reasons. But if you just take the very large firms, Eric Schmidt was brought in, Sheryl Sandberg was brought in, Blake Shotwell, these COO, CEOs, and doesn't always have to be a COO leader, are brought in to uh, mostly complement
Yeah.
the CEO and help the CEO just do more of what the CEO and the founder is typically good at,
Yeah.
um, and typically doesn't have experience in. That doesn't mean that the COO decides where the cash is spent.
Yeah.
It really is a board or CEO board decision, should be sort of where the budget gets sent.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. And one thing we alluded to earlier on, which I'm interested in exploring a little bit, you talked about the differences between being when you're Google and Amazon, when you're that sort of scale of organization. Obviously, you can invest a huge amount in new moonshots and new ideas and so on. Yeah, the 70-20-10 works well. And when you're not, you can't. And we talked a little bit about OKRs as well and other mechanisms that you've experienced. And obviously, you've been involved at the top levels at Google and sort of helping organize some things there. And then you're involved in leadership involved with the leadership of companies that were invested in, and now you're advising startups. What's the differences? Like, should we in a scale up, should we be emulating Google and Amazon and others? Should we copy their stuff wholesale, or are there specific things that you think should be copied or should be changed? I mean, I've got my own opinions on how OKRs should be adapted, for example, but I'm interested in your take on what other things you've experienced.
Yeah, look, that's a huge question that you can ask, from people management to cash management, what their strategy approach is. If you're a Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and you have strong market position, should we say, you can use that in all sorts of ways. If you're at the other end of the spectrum, you can use your agile nature in all sorts of ways. So yeah, you have to look at who the business is and apply relevant strategies and logic. But let's just take OKRs, as that's relevant to you and I think a lot
Yeah.
of the audience. How Google does OKRs is not how a startup, and again, I think it's important to size the startup, but if you're a 20-person, 30-person startup, having a structure for sort of working out what is the strategy and how does that translate in people's organized, and using OKRs in a simple way for that, absolutely. You don't have to, and you shouldn't adopt how Google does OKRs then, or indeed today.
Yeah.
It's really just as you wouldn't adopt, I don't know, the HR systems, which are
Right.
again way. So you wouldn't think of doing that, or the cash management systems, or the strategies. So why implement OKRs in the same way? And I think
Exactly.
have to be pretty. There's videos, and you can go and read the John the book. You
Yes.
need to sort of apply those in the right way to where you are in your journey through these things. And I personally think that's different um, pre 20 people, pre product market fit.
Yeah.
I think that's different again in the Series A, B, 40 to 100, 150 person game.
Yeah.
That gets different again when you have to scale and you're pre IPO and you've got a US and a UK and a
Yeah.
couple of products and you're turning over 20 million, 25 million. It's different again. And then when you're post IPO,
Yeah.
it's different again. So I think there's a lot of misperception here that it's just like,
Yeah.
oh, Google did it. We just need to sort of,
We copy what they did.
rinse and repeat and we'll be successful. It's like,
Yeah.
no.
One of the errors that I've seen made is if people hire, these startups will hire someone out of Google or hire someone out of Amazon or whatever, and those people will sort of try and bring what they believe in, what worked for them, wholesale. And it doesn't always, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But usually, we were talking about this earlier on. We're saying even just presenting it as a consultant, here's what we did at Google. It doesn't always work simply because the organization is different, and also because the organization believes they are different, and that's pretty important. And they don't have those same problems and same skills. And there's a saying, I think it was Mikitani, and I don't know, it was Yuji Mikitani, and he founded the Rakuten, which is the big Japanese marketplace.
Yep.
And his saying is basically every time a company triples in size, everything breaks. So you kind of got to replace everything every time you triple in size, and that might be your management system, your strategy, or the way you're working at strategy. All of those sorts of things will change on a regular basis. But he was saying it changes. But the flip side of this is also that if you adopt something that works really well for a 10,000 person company, if you're a 200 person company, it's not going to work well. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, a couple of points there. So structurally, you have challenges here. Most SaaS businesses try for a triple, double type of growth curve, which means that you are facing those challenges that you have to change and evolve. It's not just about hiring people from Google, Amazon, Facebook. This happens continually because
Yeah.
folks hire. It's like, okay, I need somebody more senior in sales who's done these things, HR, finance, insert, whatever, technical. And so you'll look, the safe bet is to go and look for somebody at the company one stage or two stages on. And say, oh, look, they can manage a 500-person team. And that's what they've done lots of.
Yeah.
Great, I'll just hire them into my 50-person team and they'll know what to do. And so very often you find folks that are hired who are excellent and have got brilliant careers in slightly larger firms. And then you find that they come and try to put a larger firm process strategy or one stage onto a group that is still quite emergent. And that causes tension all over the place. So it's about, I think, because you do need to hire ahead, but
Yeah.
you need to hire ahead and then try to manage things up that curve in stepping stones towards that 500 things. And that takes some science, it takes some art, it takes some judgment calls.
Yeah.
And COOs, just like other groups, are in that phase.
In that. Yeah, for sure. Hey, JB, I'm realizing the time. It's 48 past. We did say that we'd finish at 45 past, so I've gone a little bit over. I do actually have one question from an audience. Do you have a couple minutes to just take one question, or do you need to wrap up? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. I'll see if I can add it to it's on the screen here, but it's not showing the text. Anyway, I'll read it. Add 150 to 200 staff scale up. What do you think is the secret is to balance between keeping things simple and focused and introducing just enough process and controls, because now there are a lot more people to keep moving in the same direction cross-functionally. So what's the balance between keeping things simple and focused and having process and controls?
As a COO, I don't know who this person is, but as a COO, pick your battles and focus on a core couple of things. If you are, and again, it depends on the market, scale, strategies. So there's a lot of noise and edge cases, but don't try and do everything. Pick a core couple of things and get those right. OKRs would be one that I think you need to. I'm a believer that it doesn't have to be OKRs. Everybody does use OKRs, but I think getting a organization that is 150, 200 people, which then will typically have a 70-person sales org, an 80-person engineering tech org, other new functions that come in, getting that group working closely and aligned together works well. So OKRs is one I would say needs to work well. I would say the drumbeat of the organization,
Yeah.
the meeting cadence, what we use the term modus operandi, and how those meetings work together with the OKRs and the organization structure is a second, because you can't do everything in one meeting anymore.
Yeah.
To have sales focused meeting, product focused meetings, or again, it
Yeah.
depends who you are and where you're at, but the drumbeat and the meeting cadence would be another area I would suggest sort of bring some structure to. You don't have to be as formulaic and process as some areas, but bring some structure and some set of rules and
Yeah.
guidance to. And then the third area I would suggest is the organizational structure, who does what, and just
Yeah.
being clear in the core, who does what, how do they work, where do the handoffs happen. Um, and at that stage, you often have to get into the leveling situation and
Yeah. We
the
had a,
titling situation for a number of reasons, which I don't have time to get into now. But
yeah.
those would be three areas that I would bring some structure to.
Yeah.
Not necessarily process, but structure to get people aligned. But you can't go the full hog
Yeah.
because you'll just the organization will freeze up into a bureaucratic mess.
Yeah. I've always thought of it also as being a matter of you've got to solve the problems you have, not the ones that you imagine you might have in the future or the ones that you know other people have. And there are a few things that you need to solve ahead of time. And one of those, as I understand from talking to Janie Links, who I think you may know from Google, but you may
Yes.
not, was about leveling. You know, how like introducing leveling early enough in the organization, because by the time you have the real problem, then it's very painful to introduce.
And on that topic, there's some very clear do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
So it's quite easy to implement the core of some of these things.
Excellent. Well, look, thanks very much for your time, JB. Really appreciate having you on here. I've really enjoyed having a chat with you. If anyone wants to get in contact with you, the best way is on LinkedIn, to connect to you on LinkedIn, or imjb.com, but Jonathan Bullock on LinkedIn. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you can find me enough there. Drop me a line.
Excellent. Well, look, thanks very much for joining. I really appreciate it. We'll wrap up now, and you can hang around for a moment. We'll have a brief chat afterwards. But thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for your question, Petra. Anyone else who did ask a question somewhere and it didn't come through, I'm sorry, my technology didn't do what I expected it to do, so I may have missed one. But anyway, we'll have a look. We'll get back to you later on. All right. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Right. We've